What do you picture when you see a slave in early America? Chances are, you see a black person being at the end of a whip. Don't get us wrong, the transatlantic slave trade was a tragedy that should never be forgotten. But there is another history that America has forgotten about when talking about slavery, and that's the enslavement of Native Americans. Most of us know some of the turmoil that the Native Americans faced, but many textbooks have erased the darkest secret of all, that they were enslaved just like the African Americans. In this video, we will dive deeper into the shocking world of indigenous slaves. But before we do, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. Now, let's begin with another shocking truth. The Native Americans would enslave each other. Before we talk about the enslavement of Native Americans, it's worth noting that there was slavery among different indigenous tribes. One example was the Haida and Tlingit tribes. These warrior tribes, who primarily lived on the coast of southeastern Alaska, would keep slaves as prisoners of war. There were other tribes too, such as the Yurok, Comanche, Pawnee, and Klamath, that owned slaves as well. With that said, there were differences between this form of slavery and the slavery Native Americans performed. European slavery was based on the belief that other races were inferior. However, Native American slavery was about ethnicity, or a result of conflict. If one group won over the other, slaves were seen as collateral for beating the others. Sometimes natives would simply enslave other Native Americans just because they won in a skirmish against another. Also, slaves had a chance to integrate into the community over a period of time. Even though it was viewed differently, some tribes would treat their slaves horrifically as well, sometimes even using them as food in times of famine or having them work for life. We should stress that just because slavery wasn't racially based, that doesn't make it okay. Keeping a human being as a slave is a horrific part of humanity that should never be forgotten or repeated. It goes to show that every group of people, no matter how marginalized they are nowadays, also has a dark past, whether they like to admit it or not. But the slavery the natives had to deal with was not a case-by-case situation, but equally horrifying no matter what tribe you are in. The Encomienda system. The slavery of Native Americans did not begin once the Mayflower hit the shores. It happened a century earlier. Encomienda, which is based on the term to entrust, was a labor system that involved the exploitation of non-Christians. Through the Encomienda system, Spanish conquistadors demanded labor and tributes from the indigenous people in the Americas. Their reasoning came from an obligation to Christianize and protect these indigenous people, a sort of savior system to convert them to Christianity. It's debated whether or not this was intended to be slavery, as the conqueror obtained military protection and education. There were also protections for certain groups, including Native Americans. However, in many cases, it oftentimes resulted in forced labor and further exploitation. Some, however, did take care of those who worked for the conquistadors. For example, in 1501, Isabella I of Castile declared Native Americans as equals, so enslaving them was illegal unless there were stringent conditions. She also provided explicit instructions for governance in her colonies, acknowledging that while labor was needed, protections needed proper implementation. Another example is of the clergyman Bartolomé de las Casas. In his early writings, he declared that Africans should be used as slaves instead of Native Americans. However, he later retracted this statement and spoke out against slavery regardless of skin color. These facts show that there are still differences between slavery before versus after the arrival of the European settlers. The laws, in theory, treated Native Americans in a sacred manner. This is not to say that Native Americans were treated well, however. In practice, many Native Americans were still enslaved and mistreated. In fact, it's estimated that over 2,500 Native Americans were shipped to the Iberian Peninsula to be slaves. While the Encomienda system promised to be about assimilation, not abuse, many Native Americans were still tortured and even killed for their resistance. Some were married into non-natives and had children, gradually erasing the identity of their descendants. Even when not outright abused, many natives had to work in their mines, work on farms, and help build the settlements of the Spanish people. Even when treated well in the best circumstances, forcing a tribe to act and believe like you are not seen in a positive light. However, the slavery of Native Americans during this time was not codified. However, it would soon be when another entity came into the picture, affecting the overall picture of slavery and morphing it into a similar picture we know today. The arrival of the Brits. The Brits' arrival is something that is not spoken about often in history, but it is something that we should not forget because of the atrocities committed. This history has been downplayed in textbooks, if mentioned in all, but that is partially because the enslavement of Native Americans is lesser known than African Americans. Between 1492 to 1880, up to 5.5 million Native Americans were enslaved. Meanwhile, 12.5 million African Americans were enslaved. Considering that the number of Native Americans enslaved was almost half the number of African Americans, and it was an act done for centuries, one may wonder why this part of history isn't discussed. One reason why is something that's persistent with any retelling of history and myths. History tries to tell the facts, but it's often biased, and with much time between now and then, myth often becomes fact. In this case, there are two myths surrounding the enslavement. Myth 1. Native Americans were not desired as slaves. Instead, Africans were vastly preferred. Myth 2. After King Philip's War, many of the Native Americans were exterminated or exiled, meaning very few were kept as slaves. Besides these two myths, the legal status of Native Americans is also to blame for how difficult it is to know the full scope of Native American slavery. But we do know some things, including the fate of Native Americans in slavery after King Philip's War. King Philip's War. When you hear the name King Philip, you may imagine a British king. However, King Philip refers to a Native American leader, also known as Metacomet. Before the war, relations between the English settlers and the native tribes seemed stable. Metacomet's father, Massasoit, had good relations with the Plymouth colony, and because of that, Metacomet renamed himself Philip. But after Philip became chief after his father passed away, tensions grew. From land disputes to the execution of his fellow tribe members, Philip soon waged war on the colonists and put up a good fight, with the war lasting nearly 3 years. The victor receives the spoils, which include captured and even surrendered tribespeople becoming slaves. Many tribespeople who knew they were about to lose surrendered, as they were promised leniency if they did so. Some, such as the female chief Awashonks of the Sakonnet Indians, surrendered, being promised that her people would not be killed or enslaved. Some of them were even shipped far away from their home. Yet another reason why we don't know the full scope of Native American enslavement is that many Native Americans were traded to other countries. Bermuda, Jamaica, Spain, Barbados, the Azores, and Tangier are countries a Native American may have been shipped to. These Caribbean countries often had plantations where the tribespeople spent grueling hours working and being away from their loved ones. Many of these locations did not have a set system to record who ended up on their plantations or their ultimate fate. Why were they often shipped far away instead of being enslaved domestically? One reason for this was the colonization of land. The Native Americans were a group known for their warrior spirit. The victors expected that many would run away or resist if they were enslaved locally. An island, meanwhile, would be unfamiliar territory with very little chance of escaping. Even said that some did manage to make it back, but it was rare. In truth, most lived and died on the islands that they were sent to, never seeing the mainland again. Sometimes the decision to send them to another island came from other tribespeople working with the English. The Uncas tribe, who was working with the English, believed that sending their fellow natives to an island would protect them in the long run, letting them have a new settlement. For many of these Native Americans working with English, their goal was not to throw their tribespeople under the bus, but to keep them safe and out of English homes. In some cases, these Native Americans would have the captives be their servants, or act as middlemen in the slave trade. The exporting of Native Americans was quite massive. Here's a shocking fact. Between 1670 and 1715, more Native Americans were exported from Charleston, South Carolina, than the number of Africans imported. When we think of the American slave trade, many of us imagine the U.S. getting the majority of slaves, but they were large exporters too. Still, the ones who did say did had to face horrors. The horrors of slavery. While the Native Americans tried compromising with the tribespeople, they still faced the shocking horrors of slavery, and their stories should never be forgotten. How bad did things get? The Native Americans were subject to unfair terms that would constantly shift the goalposts, so freedom became not more than a dream for many. One example is a 1676 Connecticut decree that said that a native's term of service could not be shortened but could be lengthened. So, a tribesman may go into slavery for just 3 years, but then end up being a slave for life. Other laws did give a limit, but it was a long one. For example, a Native American under the age of 5 could be enslaved until they were 30. While 30 is still a relatively young age, it's long enough where, once you're free, adjusting to a free life feels like an impossible task. especially when you're separated from your tribe. The slavery of natives meant that families were separated, and the kinship that many of the tribesmen had was shattered. And the second generation of Native American slaves did not fare much better. These became indentured servants as a compromise between keeping them enslaved and letting them go. Indentured servitude is a contract-based system that does have differences between slavery. But like many things in this video, it was a lot different in practice than in theory. It wasn't just indentured servitude that was used as a euphemism for slavery. Another example was the terms adoption or apprenticeship. These words seemed so benign and, in the case of adoption, almost wholesome. But they carried with them some dark intentions, and it often led to the death of many Native Americans. One example is the 1850 Act for the Government and Protections of Indians, which made it so that Native children could become indentured servants. But the California law ended up with the capture and enslavement of more Native Americans than ever. Many whites were going to California for the gold rush, and they needed slaves to help them mine for gold. Many Native Americans were killed during this rush, and it's what's now known as the California Genocide. Process that. A bill about protecting a group of people leads to a large number of them being killed. Some estimated the number of deaths to be over 100,000, and this genocide lasted until 1873. Yes, even after the 13th Amendment, the law was still in effect, albeit with some parts repealed. The entire law was repealed on a date that may shock you. It wasn't repealed a few years after, but it took until 1937. You would not expect such a law to be in effect close to World War II, but it was. And it would be much, much longer before Native Americans got an apology. How much longer? 1950s? 1960s? Try 2019. Yes, in 2019, Gavin Newsom finally issued an apology for the law. At this point, everyone involved with this law was dead and gone. But for the tribes who still felt the effects generations later, it was better late than never. The stories don't just stop with slavery and genocide, but prostitution. One particularly gruesome horror story is of the Ute woman. This story was, unfortunately, the combination of both the Native American and European slave trade. The Ute tribe settled in what is now considered Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. The Arapaho tribe captured one woman and then sold her to a member of the Cheyenne. However, this member did not have the kinship you'd expect, instead trying to please American soldiers in a disgusting way. The Cheyenne forced the Ute woman to be a prostitute for American soldiers. Men could have their way with this poor woman for 50 cents. In today's money, that's a little over $15, so she was sold out at a very cheap price. She died in 1880 from a hemorrhage, and it was believed that the cause of this hemorrhage was excessive sexual intercourse. This once again reinforces that slavery, while it could be heavily against one group, could sometimes be mutual. One way to illustrate this is through the overlap between African and Native American slaves. Finally, let's discuss the slavery of Native Americans by the Mormon settlers. As you may know, Utah has a high Mormon population, and this is mainly due to the Mormon pioneers who moved there to escape persecution for their religious beliefs. While you may believe that this would leave them to be empathetic with the Native Americans, that was not the case. The Mormon pioneers would settle on Native American land and begin oppressing the people there, and Territory Governor Brigham Young even legalized slavery in 1852. While the time of Native American slavery was relatively short, as the 13th Amendment would be passed 13 years later, it still led to over 400 Native American children being used to build homes and suffering mistreatment. The U.S. government even condemned Utah and said that it was the only part of the U.S. that enslaved Native Americans. Of course, this claim is very dubious, as you've learned throughout this video. But still, it was true that the Mormon enslavement of Native Americans was a dark part of the history of that religion. Nowadays, less than 2% of Utah is Native American, with the Mormon settlers decimating the population by 86%. These are just some stories to be told about Native American settlers. As mentioned, many of these tales have been lost to time due to how hush-hush the slave trade was, or the fact that Native Americans often didn't count as citizens. It's important to acknowledge what happened, not just to the Native Americans, but to others enslaved as well, including by the natives themselves. While the suffering of Native Americans as slaves was horrific, some tribes had the philosophy of, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. Let's now discuss how some tribes would enslave African Americans. While there are similarities, the parallels differ. African versus Native. It was normal for African and Native American slaves to cross paths and to mixed results. Sometimes they would work together, and other times they'd show that even when there was a shared suffering, the people who suffered fought each other. Black people and indigenous tribes met each other as early as 1502, when Spanish settlers who owned an African slave encountered a Native American. Over the following centuries, many enslaved Native Americans would work alongside African Americans, and there would be a lot of camaraderie. cultures were shared, and many myths on both ends would be shared and intermingle. They would work together as farmhands or as maids. Sometimes, a Native American and an African American would marry. One notable example is Tituba. Tituba was declared a Native American at the time, but she is believed to be of African descent, as she was from the Caribbean. She was married to a Spanish Indian known as John Indian, and she was later accused of witchcraft and was among the accused in the Salem witch trials. Luckily, she was found not guilty of witchcraft. But many Native American tribes owned black slaves, and slaves they were in the European sense. Some tribes began adopting the ways of the white man, particularly in the 5 tribes, being Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. In the Civil War, some Native Americans fought alongside the Union, but others joined the Confederacy to keep the practice of owning slaves continuing. After the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, this did not immediately free the African American slaves owned by these tribes. Many of these tribes lived in territories outside of the colonized U.S., known as Indian Territory. It took until a year later for the treaties of 1866 to be signed. These treaties made peace with the 5 tribes and freed the slaves owned by Native Americans. While these treaties helped the U.S. make peace with the Native Americans and free enslaved African Americans, the U.S. also had ulterior motives. They wanted the Indian Territory to expand the U.S., and expand they did. The enslavement of Native Americans is a messy, complicated subject that has been lost to the history books. Many of us know that Native Americans suffered, but their slavery of them has been lost to time. Sometimes it's downplayed due to euphemistic terms like indentured servitude, or the fact that many natives were shipped to Caribbean islands instead of being on the mainland USA. But it's a part of history that shouldn't be forgotten, and in recent years, more historians have been bringing it up, and for good reason. This era of the US led to tribes being destroyed by separating children from their families, and in some cases, actual genocides happened, with apologies a century later. Though it is nice they acknowledge the horrors and wrongs inflicted, it does not absolve them of their actions or the profound effects of enslavement that extended for almost a century longer. This is not to say that it was a one-way street. As mentioned, Native Americans faced injustice before the European settlers, had their own slavery, and even learned from the settlers and owned their own African slaves. They often sold captured servants to white settlers, including one incident leading to the horrific death of an innocent woman. History is very complicated, and no side is 100% good or bad. But for the most part, Native Americans were oppressed and are still feeling the impact all these years later. One could say it's all in the past, but most of the country has yet to acknowledge it. The Native Americans still living in small reserves are still feeling the impact of the past. It's worth remembering, discussing, and looking for ways to improve the lives of the remaining tribes as we move forward. If you liked this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. Feel free to leave us a comment on your thoughts about this video and what point of the Native American slave history left an impression on you the most.